Welcome to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, here to share some amazing conversations. We're talking business, health, making and saving money, or starting something epic. Think of this as your go-to spot for stories that do a lot more than just kill time. They spark ideas, give you a boost, and perhaps even change the way you look at the world. I'm pulling in the experts, the thinkers, the doers, and the dreamers. We're about to dive into stories that open doors and ideas that light up your brain. Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, and with me today is my guest, Morgan Adams. How are you today, Morgan?
I am doing very well, Desiree. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, wonderful. I am so excited for this conversation. This is something that I find so fascinating and have experienced issues myself. And just to clarify, Morgan, you are a holistic sleep coach. You're the founder and creator of Morgan Adams Wellness. And so we're going to be diving into sleep and sleep issues. And so again, welcome to the show. And would you tell us, Morgan, how this journey happened for you? Like, what inspired you to found Morgan Adams Wellness? And just take it away.
Yeah. Well, I had insomnia pretty bad in my mid-30s. So almost 20 years ago. It was a while ago. And I had what they call sleep onset insomnia, which is a fancy way of saying it took me a long time to fall asleep, 1 to 2 hours most nights. And it was kind of kicked off by like a romantic challenge in a relationship. We won't go there. But after about 2 or 3 months of this, I got really tired of like not being able to fall asleep and feeling awful the next day. So I went to my primary care doctor and was prescribed Ambien, which is a very commonly known sleep pill. And back then, I was a pharmaceutical sales rep. So in my world, like medications was just like no big deal because that's kind of was my currency, sort of. And I didn't have any issue accepting the pill. And it did work as advertised in that it did help me get to sleep faster. But there were some side effects the next day, a lot of grogginess, brain fog. I didn't feel fully alert until close to lunchtime. Felt like a hangover without having drank alcohol. And sort of a little bit further in my career, I became somebody who did PR for a health department and had to write really fast and on a deadline. And my brain was moving so slowly at that time, but I was getting in trouble, at work for not like producing quickly enough. And then at the time I had started dating a new guy who now is my husband. And he said to me, kind of come to Jesus talk. Hey, Morgan, when you take these pills at night, like you kind of become a zombie, and it freaks me out a little bit. And I was like, oh my gosh. Yeah, this is probably something I should be investigating. So I made the decision to go off the pills. Now, I did something that I do not recommend other people do, and that is to just go it alone without the guidance of your prescribing provider. So if you're out there, whether it's a sleeping pill or any kind of medication, just get with your provider to get a schedule of getting off the meds. But I did it kind of rogue, and just because I'm very determined, I was able to do it pretty successfully without any kind of negative consequences. And I slept fairly well for years after that. I mean, nothing to complain about. And then there was a little plot twist. And that plot twist was something that we all collectively experienced March of 2020 when the pandemic started. And nobody knew which way was up. We were like, are we staying inside? What are we doing? So my sleep started to kind of tank a little bit. And I got concerned because I did not want to go down that road of insomnia once again. So I got myself an Oura Ring to track my sleep. I started Googling sleep and reading about sleep. And sure enough, I was able to get my sleep straightened out in pretty short order. And I became just interested in sharing organically what I was doing with folks on Facebook. Like this was not a business then. This was just me being like, cool, these things are working. And I came to find out that a lot of other women in my circle were struggling with their sleep around the same time. And I thought to myself, okay, there are a lot of people who need help with their sleep. And at this stage in my life, I was like 2 years post breast cancer diagnosis. And that we won't go down that route, but that's a whole other thread we could touch on if we wanted to. But that experience with the breast cancer was a really pivotal point in my life as far as like, what do I want to do as far as like my mission, my purpose. And I kind of thought I want to do something to help other women with their health. And I just Didn't know really how that would shake out. And then once I discovered this fascination with sleep, it was like everything kind of came together. And I said to myself, I'm going to be a sleep coach. And my husband was like, that's amazing. Like, totally, that's so you. And people need that. And of course, then I had to kind of figure out, well, how does one do that? You have to get trained. And so I went through a bunch of certifications and trainings. And then in 2021, launched my business, Morgan Adams Wellness. And I've just been having an amazing time helping other women get their sleep back on track. So that is my origin story. A little bit long and twisted, but that's what it is.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Morgan. I think it highlights a few things. One, our life is never straight path, right? There's twists and turns and things that happen that make us go like, aha, and realize we now need to take a different direction than we originally thought. And also that we're not alone if we're experiencing sleep issues. And so getting help, whether it be working with your primary doctor to take medication or whether it's some holistic method, I think we can find a solution. And so thank you also for sharing your experience with the sleeping pills and specifically Ambien. And that actually is a question I wanted to ask you. And that's kind of what's your thoughts around taking sleeping pills? Are they addictive? And is it something that we absolutely have to do if we're experiencing these difficulties falling asleep, or is there something else we can do?
Yeah. So I think there is a place for sleeping pills in the whole grand scheme of things. And really, that proper place is when there is a crisis situation, a temporary situation like a divorce, a death, or a job loss. When you look at the package inserts for these medications, they do clearly state they are not meant to be used over 4 weeks. So a lot of people don't know that. And so what ends up happening a lot, and from what I've seen in my own experience personally, is that doctors, bless their hearts, they have great training, but they've fallen short, not because of their own fault, but because the medical school system only gives them about 2 hours of sleep science training while they're going through their professional credentials, right? And so they don't really have the skill set to help a client or a patient with their sleep. So what is the easiest thing to do is to hand them a script for sleeping medication. Like I totally see how that happens. They're not to be blamed because they're part of the system. But what happens is the doctors are not giving their patients like an exit strategy. They're not saying, Desiree, you're going through a hard time. I'm going to give you these pills for a month, and then we're going to talk about how to get off of them. What I'm finding with like a lot of my clients is that they've been on sleeping pills 10, 15, almost 20 years. It's too long, because what sleeping pills do is basically give you sedation. They're not actually giving you true deep restful sleep. They're changing your sleep architecture, and they have the potential to lead to psychological dependence, right? And so the alternative to sleeping medications, which I like to share with people, is something called CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And that is recommended first line by the American Academy of Physicians as something to do before sleeping pills, because CBTI doesn't have any short-term or long-term side effects. I'm a big fan of that. I implement that in my practice for the appropriate person. And unfortunately, a lot of primary care physicians don't really know what that is yet. And if they do know what it is, they don't know how to connect their patient with a provider. There's a lot of, and there are not enough providers, quite frankly, who do this kind of work. So we have some issues in the medical field that we need to iron out, but that's a story for another day.
Well, thank you, though, for going into that detail, because I think it points out that just like many other cases, it's here, take a pill, here, take this prescription, here, and it's not really getting to the root cause of the issue. This is just like masking whatever is occurring and not really solving the problem. So I think that applies not just here, but in a lot of other cases. And also the fact that they're not getting the training that they need to really get to that root cause. And I mean, bless them, they go through a lot and they're dealing with a lot of patients, and that's another topic. And just like you shared, there's not enough practitioners who can help people who need this kind of solution. But yeah, I think it's so important that we're looking at what is actually happening in our body or in our life that is causing this issue with our sleep. And so that's where getting into holistic, right? Sounds like you're going to be working on what is really happening in your body, in your mind to solve this problem. So let's talk a little bit about that aspect of it and what is going on. Why are we suffering from poor sleep? Why are we having trouble falling asleep? Let's start there.
Yeah, there are so many reasons. And just a few that I'll share that I think are very critical to look at. Our circadian rhythms these days have really become quite misaligned because many of us are living out of alignment with nature. We're getting too much brightness at night, not enough brightness during the day. We've got irregular schedules, haphazard schedules. And so many of us are operating from this place of circadian rhythm misalignment, right? There's also the issue of stress and anxiety. There's a lot coming at us, and sometimes we lack the tools to really help us mitigate that stress. And then also, I think there are just things in our environment that are just not suitable for our sleep, and just the way our sleeping environment can be non-conducive to sleep. And we could talk a little bit more about the proper environment, as well as just physical issues that people have, having aches and pains, having hot flashes, night sweats. So there's just a myriad of things that can get into the mix. And quite often when I'm working with my clients, it's not just one thing. It's usually kind of a hodgepodge of many different things. And so that's one of the reasons why I call myself the holistic sleep coach, is because I'm looking at all of the possibilities. I'm looking at like diet and nutrition and movement and chronotype, which is basically, are you a night owl or are you a morning lark? And wind down routines. So there's like so many different levers we can pull on this topic. So in short, there's usually just not one issue. It's multifactorial. And that's why it's good if you're having trouble with your sleep, is to kind of get an outside perspective, because sometimes when we're having problems ourselves, it's easy to kind of have blind spots as to what's going wrong. You kind of need like somebody to kind of open up and say like, okay, here are some possibilities you may not have thought of already that might be impacting your sleep.
Yeah, great points for sure. And I think what's interesting is there are some things that can be quite easily changed in there. Some things that maybe will take longer and are a little bit more difficult to address, but you're talking about environment. So that's something that we have a lot of control over in our bedroom situation, the lighting. We can make changes there quite easily, I think. So maybe share some other things that we can do, that we can begin to make some changes that will help with our sleep pattern. And maybe let's get into some of the other things that we can change. And I love that you shared about the night owl in the morning lark. That's super interesting to know. And I haven't talked with anybody about this before. So let's dive into some of those things and see what we can do to change.
Yeah. So I think if I were having trouble sleeping, probably the first place I would start is having a consistent sleep wake time. Consistency is extremely important in keeping our circadian rhythm on track. And where you really want to start is a consistent wake up time, right? So we want to really aim to have that consistent wake up time, plus or minus 30 minutes. We have a little bit of wiggle room. And what that consistent wake up time does, it really kind of sets our hormonal pattern to kind of be regulated. We're going to have the appropriate melatonin and cortisol pulses when we have that really anchored wake up time. And another really cool thing about the anchored wake up time is that it automatically kind of sets you up to become sleepy around the same time each night. So after you've woken up, you've got about 14 to 16 hours of time that this sleep chemical called adenosine builds up in your body and has to be released through sleep. So by virtue of having that really dialed in wake up time, you're going to probably have a very consistent going to bedtime as well. So everything kind of just falls into place. So the consistency is really, really critical. And they did a study, I think January of 2024, where they actually found that people who had more consistent sleep-wake cycles had a lower mortality rate, which is really fascinating because we often talk so much about quantity of sleep, like how many hours did you log? People get really obsessed on that hours logged. But in this study, they found that people who slept 6 hours consistently with a regular schedule had a lower mortality rate than somebody who slept 8 hours with an irregular, interrupted schedule. So it's super critical. The next thing I would really lean in on would be your morning light. Now, this is something that is starting to kind of pick up popularity, but essentially what this concept is about is getting your eyes on natural light as soon as you can in the morning, within like 30 minutes of waking. If you can see the sunrise, that's amazing. And what this does, it really strengthens your circadian rhythm. And when you have your eyes exposed to that natural light from the outside, it's sending these signals to your suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is your circadian pacemaker. And your cortisol gets boosted naturally. Any residual melatonin from the night before gets shut down. And then a little bit later on in the morning is something called UVA light. And this is a period of time that happens after sunrise. It depends on where you are geographically, but it's usually about an hour-long period where it's kind of like, I call it like the magic hour, because you have the ability, your body has the ability to convert these aromatic amino acids in your eyes to neurotransmitters and hormones. So we can convert serotonin into melatonin for the next night. It can convert amino acids into neurotransmitters for focus and mood boosting. It can even help regulate your thyroid. So there's like so many, and your metabolism. Like it's a beautiful time of day to be able to be out. So I always encourage people to like try to, if you can, I mean, we all have various schedules, but if you can block out some time in the morning to really get those, what I call light snacks, it will really set you up for success with your energy, your mood, and your sleep. And then I think the final thing that I would lean in on, and I know everyone knows about this, but I don't know if they know it in the context with sleep, but is exercise. So we know that exercise has been shown to help with sleep latency, how fast you fall asleep, sleep quality, deep sleep. There's like 13 different meta-analysis showing that exercise helps with deep sleep, particularly in older adults, which is really nice. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like do an intense workout every day, but it's really more like a moderate workout, probably 5 out of 7 days a week. And again, the reason why, one of the reasons is because when we're really active and doing exercise, it builds up that sleep chemical I just referenced called adenosine. So have you ever noticed yourself, you may have noticed that on the days that you're really active, maybe you've had a workout or been really active, you might become sleepier at night. So the days where we're just kind of loafing around, maybe on the weekend, we're not really active, it might be a little bit harder for us to fall asleep.
Oh my gosh, Morgan, so many great points in there and so interesting. I had no idea that time that you were describing, that hour in the morning where you're getting this light and what the chemicals and the reactions and everything that it's influencing in your body that's so important for our health and well-being and our brain function and all of this. It's just like, wow.
Yeah. It's pretty mind-blowing. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Mind-blowing. I take advantage of being outside during this time, and I don't really see a lot of other people outside during this time. And yeah, everyone has different schedules, but I'm just like, y'all are missing out.
Yeah. And I had heard before about how important it is that we get that early morning light because it does kind of switch those levers in our circadian rhythm. It gets us back in line with, yes, it's morning, we need to be awake. And then when it's dark, it needs to be dark. We need to not be having that much light so that we can go to sleep. But this is a whole nother level like I hadn't even heard of before. So fantastic information. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And just to pull on that thread a little bit more, if anyone's interested in really understanding more about that, how that light dark cycle can help us, there's an app called My Circadian app. It's a free app. You can download it and you can actually get like a little dashboard that tells you, according to your geography, when these specific windows are happening. And they've even got like something called a lux meter in there. A lux meter is like a meter of light where you can measure your light. And so what we really want to think about is getting a lot of bright light in the morning. We want like 1300 lux for optimal metabolism function. And then like in the 3 hours before bed, we want to stay under 10 lux to really preserve our melatonin. So it's a really cool app if people are interested in really doing like the free things to help like really boost our circadian rhythm. I've found it to be super helpful for that use.
Yeah, okay, that's a great recommendation. I'll include that in the show notes. I hadn't heard of an app that did that, so thank you for sharing that with us. So something that I wanted to ask you about, you had mentioned earlier about the wearable, the Aura ring that you have, and I
Yes.
wear my watch to sleep at night to kind of keep track of my sleep. So what are your thoughts on that? And is it giving us information that's really useful, or is it just more data that we don't know what to do with?
Yeah, I think that the sleep trackers can be really useful for certain people. And so that would be the person who's able to actually look at their dashboard and make changes based on the data that they see, right? So if they're able to implement, if you're just looking at your dashboard day after day and you're not making any changes, it's kind of a waste of time and money, in my opinion, right? So I think it can be useful for a lot of people. Now, the people that I would not really say it's a great choice for are the people who have insomnia, which is like most of the people I work with. And the reason why is because people with insomnia tend to have a lot of anxiety about the minutia with their sleep. They're like, I didn't get enough deep sleep and I didn't sleep enough hours. So when they see these scores the next day, and if they're not to their liking, they may get even more stressed and anxious, which can in turn make their sleep worse. So when I'm working with people like that who have or are thinking about a wearable, I say, look, let's get your sleep recalibrated. Let's wait a while. Let's wait a few months and then bring a tool like that back to you because you really don't want it to backfire on you. There's a term called orthosomnia, which is basically hypervigilance around sleep data and sleep habits. So we find that sometimes the trackers can kind of push us into that realm of orthosomnia, which we definitely don't want.
Okay, yeah, that's another one hadn't even heard of before. So thank you for that. And I can see how, I mean, it makes total sense. If you're already anxious and worried about not getting enough sleep, having trouble falling asleep, the last thing you need is something saying, yeah, look, you're not getting enough sleep. So that's just going to exacerbate the problem and not really alleviate anything. So great advice on holding off on something like that until you can kind of get into more a good routine, good habits, and you start to really get better sleep.
Yeah. And
Um,
another thing, just real quick with the Aura, there is sort of like or the sleep trackers, there is really sort of a middle ground I like to propose to people. And that's basically looking at your data once a week, right? So instead of looking at it every single morning, is getting a little emotional distance from it by looking at it every week can kind of help you look at the trends because that's what you really want to look at. You don't want to kind of fuss over each day. So I call that kind of the middle ground approach to kind of staying sane with your wearable.
Yeah. Okay. Great suggestion. Absolutely. Look at it just once a week and see what the large picture is showing you, and then you can make some adjustments. Yeah. Looking at it day to day, I could see how that would be like, oh my gosh, oh, what do I need to change like immediately to make a difference tomorrow? And yeah, again, it's just making you more anxious. So great suggestion. So, something that I had shared with you before we started recording was this waking up in the middle of the night. And for me, it's like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock almost routinely. And I'm not the only one that has this wake up randomly at these hours. So, can you share with us maybe like what's going on and what we can do about that?
Yeah. Well, you're right. This is like a really common problem. And it's so common that I actually recently developed a free guide on this very issue. It's called Awake Again at 3 a.m. Your guide to why you're waking up and what to do about it. You can download it from my website. But let's touch on this because I think it's really important to address. So what I'll say from the beginning is that quite often there's this sort of myth or unrealistic expectation that it's important to sleep all the way through the night. Like that's an expectation. And the reality is that even a healthy sleeper wakes up multiple times per night, right? So we have about 5 to 7 sleep stages that we go through each night. And at the end of each sleep cycle, we often have a brief awakening. And that awakening, if it's less than like 2 or 3 minutes, we're really not going to remember it. And the purpose evolutionarily, is that a word? Of this is because it's for safety, scanning for safety. So way back when, before we had nice homes that had security systems, we were out in the wild, right? And we didn't know what was going to get us. So it was helpful for humans to scan for safety periodically, even during that sleep cycle. So I just like to use that. I like to share that as perspective, because when I'm working with clients who are like, I woke up last night, I'm like, that's normal. You're normal. You're a normal person. But the problem lies is when we wake up either several times, like, so it's really disruptive, or we can't fall back asleep when we wake up. Okay. So let's talk for a second about some of the reasons why we're waking up. I list them all out. I mean, there's multiple, but a few that I'm really seeing a lot of. Number one is people are waking up because they're having a blood sugar dip in the middle of the night, which jacks up your cortisol and adrenaline, waking you up. Your body's like, wake up. You don't have enough glycogen. So wake up. And then what happens is, well, the fix for that is to maybe try a small snack, like an hour before you go to bed, that has some protein, some complex carbs, and some fat. So like Greek yogurt with almonds would be a good choice, maybe half a banana with some nut butter, and see if that staves off your middle of the night awakening. And if it does, that probably means you have some blood sugar dysregulation that you could probably work on with a nutritionist. Second thing that I see quite often is people are waking up, they're too hot. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're having like night sweats or hot flashes, but they just might be overheated. And in which case, if that's happening, there are ways to mitigate that. There's ways of like changing your bedding, changing your pajamas and nightgown. Also, there's the cooling mattress pads, which are like next level, like wonderful for hot sleepers. And then lastly, I would call out sleep breathing issues as a source of wake ups. And for women in midlife, this can be particularly challenging because as we go into midlife as women, our sleep apnea rates basically become matched with those of our male counterparts. So I've worked with many women as we're going through the process of coaching. What we discover is that they do have sleep apnea because I'm like, please get a sleep study, which you can do at home, by the way. You don't have to go to a lab. And it's really shocking how many women who are normal weight, in their 40s, 30s, who have sleep apnea, right? Because women present a little bit differently with sleep apnea than men. We tend not to be as heavy snorers. We tend to present more with like fatigue and depression. So what happens quite often is a woman will go to her doctor thinking there's something wrong with her, and the doctor gives her an antidepressant or a sleeping pill, which does not address at all her sleep breathing issues. So the statistic is that about 9 out of 10 women who have sleep apnea go undiagnosed, which is again, we're going back to the medical system that's not adequately trained. It's kind of operating on stereotypes, right? If you were an overweight 60-year-old man, they'd test you lickety split, right? But if you look like you, Desiree, you're trim, or you're not quote old, they might be like, no, I don't think you have sleep apnea. You don't look the part, right? So those are really like the three that I see mainly, but there are more. And as far as what to do, there's many strategies according to what the common issue is. But if you're finding yourself lying in bed and you cannot fall back asleep, one of the recommendations that I like to share with people is if you're stressed out and you're in bed and you're tossing and turning, is to remove yourself from that stressful situation, because you don't ever really want to pair your bed with anxiety. So if you're feeling that, like, I almost call it like a switch gets flipped. Like when I'm talking to my clients, it's almost like they just kind of reach this point where they're like, I know I'm not going to fall back asleep. And when you get to that point while you're lying in bed, just go to another room, do something relaxing and pleasant and dim light until you become sleepy again, and then get back into bed and see if sleep will unfold. If you're not particularly anxious about being in bed, or you just plain don't want to get out of bed, like it's cold, like I get it. I don't want to get out of bed either because it's nice and cozy in there. You can do some things in bed to help kind of get you more relaxed. You could do progressive muscle relaxation. You can do body scan. You can do visualizations. There's a technique that I like to use myself called savoring. And basically what that is, it's like really recreating a very peaceful, serene environment, and what's kind of like find your happy place, like the place where you like to vacation. Maybe it's the mountains or the beach, and just kind of take yourself through a scene that's very comforting and calming and kind of replaying it again and again in your mind. That's often a really helpful technique too for people if they're just lying in bed and they don't want to get out of bed.
Oh gosh, great suggestions and so much fantastic information too. I mean, I had no idea about sleep apnea being possibility for this because you're right. I mean, we're not told that a normal woman that's in good condition health-wise is going to be having sleep apnea. And they're not waking themselves up with this snoring like we often see with men and our spouses if we're married to a man, because that's for sure what we see all the time or what's talked about all the time in the media, in medicine and whatever. So yeah, great information for sure. Again, just something that for me, I had never heard of before. So another thing that listeners can consider if that maybe had never crossed their mind before.
Yeah.
And the idea of taking yourself out of the situation. So if you're tossing and turning and can't go back to sleep, get up and go sit quietly in another room. Like you said, it's got to still be dark or dim. So you're not coming into that fully awake time, right? Great suggestions. And I love that idea of replaying something that's comforting to you. And then what's happening really is we're just like tricking our mind, right?
Right.
Instead of focusing on this, I can't go back to sleep. I can't go back to sleep. And just that repeating thought.
Right.
Now we're just completely like, switch gears. Now we're going to think about this. And suddenly you're back to sleep.
Yeah.
So yeah, great stuff.
There's something actually I wanted to also point out about the middle of the night awakening that's really important too, is that when we wake up at that time of night, we're actually not thinking from our rational brain. Our prefrontal cortex, that part of our rational brain, is somewhat offline. So you may have noticed if you've woken up and had weird thoughts, catastrophic thoughts, you wake up in the morning and you're like, I can't even believe I was thinking that. So I heard on a podcast the other day, someone said, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I make a contract with myself not to believe anything I think between 2 and 4 in the morning. And I thought that was just really, really helpful advice. I have to literally coach myself to do this sometimes because I will wake up in the middle of the night and start thinking crazy things. And I'm like, okay, you're thinking crazy things because your brain isn't working properly. Now, don't think that thing right now. Think it in the morning and like when you're more rational. So I just wanted to point that out because a lot of people get way over focused on the thoughts that are negative, and we're kind of wired to do that. So you're not abnormal if you do that.
Oh my gosh, Morgan, another great like nugget of wisdom right there. Remembering first of all that we're wired to do that wake up for safety, first of all, and that our brain isn't fully functioning. If we think about fully functioning in terms of logical, to think about those sleep cycles, right? And what's happening, we're like in REM sleep, we're in deep sleep, we're kind of in that middle, and then we wake up and it's like, what were we just in? We were in that dreaming kind of neverland. We weren't really in that logical part of our brain. And so when we're having these things that pop up, it's like, well, no wonder.
Right.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, great stuff. I love it. Okay, so let's see what I want to go from here. Okay, is there anything that we haven't shared so far that you haven't expressed that you think the listener really needs to know? Maybe tips or steps to help with better sleep or anything else that you can think of that you want to share right now?
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is really more about mindset and how we talk to ourselves. I've worked with clients who they have insomnia and they really trash talk their sleep. They really will be like, my crappy sleep. They'll say crappy, but in a more colorful language. Yeah, you know what I mean? And the way that they talk about their sleep, I'm a terrible sleeper. When we say things like that about ourselves, we're perpetuating our own self-belief about our sleep. So what I encourage people to do when they're having that negative self-talk about their sleep is instead of saying, I'm a terrible sleeper, saying, I'm having some challenges with my sleep right now, but I'm committed to doing X, Y, and Z to get my sleep more in a better state, right? The same thing applies to parents. Their child is not a, quote, great sleeper. Don't give your child that label because that child will grow up thinking, I'm a terrible sleeper. I want to share that I'm not advocating a place of toxic positivity with their sleep and saying, I'm the best sleeper ever, but really moving from a place of negativity to more of a place of neutrality, I think is often really, really helpful. So the mindset piece is really, really important when you're on a journey to get better sleep.
Yeah, great point for sure. That idea of, I mean, really what we say to ourselves is so important. And when we're repeating the same negative thing to ourselves, of course, it's just going to like, what is it, sort of entrench that belief and thought in our minds until we prove it. And
Right.
so by changing the way that we're saying that, and I like how you said, just go to neutral. I'm having some challenges with this right now, but I'm excited about trying this new thing or attempting to make some changes in this way. I think that that makes all the difference in how we're addressing the problem and ourselves and having some compassion for what we're experiencing, what we're going through. So I think great point. Yeah, love it. Okay, let's see. So you touched a little bit on nutrition and you did mention a couple of things that we could try in the evening if we were thinking we're experiencing wake ups because of that dip in our, what did you say it was? Blood sugar.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Took me a second there to get to that. Yeah. So maybe do you want to share a couple of ideas if there's things that we can do during the day also to help with our nutrition that can impact our sleep at night?
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do on that front. So I would recommend that people try to move their dinner time a little bit earlier if they can. So what we're finding is that we need about 3 hours of time in between our dinner and our sleep. Now, I know I just kind of contradicted myself a little bit because there's that whole thing about the snack. I wouldn't really say the snack should be like a mainstay of your habits, but it should be sort of like almost a therapeutic, might be a little bit of a harsh term, but a preventative, I should say, solution for the wake ups. But if you're able to do that, if you can build out that in your schedule to have a 3 hour window, I heard Gabrielle Lyon say recently in a podcast that to boost your chances of sleeping through the night, she was recommending 4 hours between dinner and bed. And she was recommending, I think, 30 grams of protein, maybe 30 grams of carbs, and 10 grams of fat, right? So she was looking at macros. So if we don't want to count macros, that's totally fine. But I think when we're looking at food choices, we want to really aim for foods that are low in saturated fat and high in fiber, if possible, as our last meal of the day. We can also think about adding a little bit of carbs to our dinner. That can be really helpful for a lot of people. I know a lot of women are conscious of carbs and they try to put their carbs in the early part of the day. But what I would challenge people to do if they're having trouble sleeping is move their carbs to dinner, because often what we see is with carbs is boosts a tryptophan, right? And that converts into serotonin, which converts into melatonin to help us become a little bit more sleepy. So I personally found that to be a really great intervention, is just adding a small amount of carbs to my dinner plate to kind of induce a little bit of the sleepiness. And then interestingly, they found that the Mediterranean diet was conducive to good sleep. They've done longitudinal studies, just observational studies, looking at the fact that people who have Mediterranean diets tend to sleep a little bit better. And it does make sense because they tend to be a little bit higher in protein, higher in fiber. And you just want to avoid processed foods as much as you can, just in general, because they tend to create these kind of blood sugar spikes, which can kind of follow us into the night, which, we already talked about, can be upsetting to our sleep.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those great suggestions. And again, just things I hadn't even realized or thought about, having not known it, that the little bit of carbs at night with your dinner, it translates into this change with these chemical reactions in your body, which lead to better sleep. So again, great stuff. And then sharing the point about shifting your dinner time if you can to try to get into a 3 hour window, dinner time to bedtime. So great suggestions. Again, Maureen, thank you so much. So you had mentioned listening to podcasts, and I always love to ask my guests if there's books or podcasts that they think are beneficial or helpful that they want to suggest the listeners check out. Would you share some with us now?
Yeah, I'm a huge podcast junkie and I listen to like all of the sleep podcasts, all of them. The best one, in my opinion, and I'm not saying this because she's my friend, she's got a stellar sleep podcast. It's called Sleep is a Skill by Molly Eastman. She has great guests. She tends to kind of lean on the side of technology quite a bit, or product oriented kind of biohacks, but it's really cool to see what new developments are out there in the sleep world. So I always listen to that. And then another podcast that I really like a lot, and I'm sure most people are familiar with it, it's the Andrew Huberman podcast. He's got such just deep, like he goes really deep into a topic. I mean, they're long episodes, but they really unpack a lot of things in those episodes that are quite interesting with neuroscience, psychology, and health. So love that. And then books, again, a lot of sleep books that I read. I think I should probably be a little bit more well-rounded, but it is what it is. So I think that if one wants to learn more about sleep and understand it better, really a pivotal book to pick up would be Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker. It was released, 2016, 2017, and it's really become a very popular source of sleep information. And it really unpacks why sleep is so important. The only caveat to that book, I have to just mention this, is that it's come under fire in some circles that are more of like the insomnia world, which I'm, part of. In other words, I believe that some people with insomnia could be actually kind of scared reading the book because he is talking so much about the importance of sleep. And I think that if you had insomnia and you read that book, you might think to yourself, I'm going to die, right? Mm-hmm. Which is not true, which is definitely not true. So word to the wise, if you are struggling with really intense insomnia, put that book on hold for a while. Read it if you're wanting to learn about sleep. You're wanting to. I think the best person for that is someone who's not prioritizing their sleep, because he really makes a very solid case for prioritizing it. So that's who I'd recommend it for.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Great suggestions. Good recommendations. I'll include the details in the show notes for the listeners to easily find those. Thank you for that book recommendation and those 2 podcasts. Good stuff. So, Morgan, lastly, before we close out, would you share with the listeners if they have questions for you, want to follow along with the work that you're doing? How would they be able to do that? Are you on social media? Do you have a website?
Yeah, my website is morganadams.wellness. I'm also on Instagram quite a bit. My handle is morganadams.wellness, and I'm also on LinkedIn. So if you want to find me, shoot me a message and I'll respond back to you, because I really genuinely love chatting with people about sleep. So don't be a stranger at all.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'll detail that information so the listeners can find you. And also you mentioned earlier about the information that you have about when you're waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning and you're like, why? Kind of a resource. And I'll detail that in the show notes so the listeners can get their hands on that, because I think that will be super beneficial as well.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you again, Morgan, so much. This has been fantastic information. So many great points. I've learned so much today. I'm sure the listeners have as well. So thank you for your time and sharing this with us. This is tremendous.
Thank you for having me, Desiree.
Yeah. Wonderful. We'll talk more soon. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to another insightful episode of the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. We appreciate your time and curiosity as we explore fascinating topics together. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to join us next week for another amazing episode. Remember, your journey of learning and growth is a continuous adventure, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next week, stay curious and keep exploring those pockets of knowledge.